He cut off his own arm with a dull knife and walked out alive. The blade was so dull it couldn't cut through skin on the first try. Aron Ralston pressed the 2-inch knife of his Leatherman multi-tool against his right forearm and began sawing back and forth like he was cutting rope. The metal had been dulled by 5 days of chipping away at solid rock, but it was the only tool he had left. Blood pooled in the narrow slot between 2 canyon walls where he'd been trapped since Tuesday morning. It was now Saturday, and he was going to cut off his own arm or die trying. 27-year-old Aron Ralston had been one of Colorado's most skilled outdoorsmen. He'd climbed 49 of the state's highest peaks, many of them solo in winter conditions that killed experienced climbers. He could rappel down frozen waterfalls, navigate whiteout blizzards, and survive for days on a handful of energy bars. But none of that mattered now. An 800-pound boulder had crushed his right hand and forearm against the sandstone wall of Blue John Canyon in Utah, and he hadn't moved more than 3 feet in 127 hours. The question wasn't whether he would die in this remote slot canyon. The question was how long his body would take to shut down, and whether anyone would ever find his bones. Ralston had entered Blue John Canyon at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, April 24, 2003. He was hiking alone, which he'd done hundreds of times before, but this time he'd broken his own safety rules. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. His truck was parked 14 miles from the nearest paved road, and the canyon itself was so remote that fewer than a dozen people visited it each year. He was carrying exactly 1 water bottle, a small backpack, and his Leatherman multi-tool. That was it. The canyon was located in the middle of nowhere, 60 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thousands of square miles of desert that could kill you in a dozen different ways. Ralston had chosen this particular route because it was challenging and almost nobody else ever went there. The Blue John Canyon system was a maze of narrow slot formations carved by flash floods over millions of years. Some sections were so tight that hikers had to remove their backpacks and squeeze through sideways. Others opened into chambers the size of cathedrals, with walls that soared 200 feet straight up. The canyon was a slot formation, barely 3 feet wide in most places, with walls that stretched 60 feet up toward a thin strip of sky. Ralston was working his way through a narrow section when he grabbed what looked like a stable boulder to lower himself down a short drop. The rock was actually loose, wedged between the canyon walls, and the moment he put his weight on it, it shifted. In less than 2 seconds, the boulder had pinned his right hand and forearm against the wall, with enough force to snap bones. He was stuck in a space so narrow he couldn't even turn his body around. The boulder weighed more than some cars, and he had no leverage to move it. His crushed hand had gone numb immediately, but he could feel the bones in his forearm grinding against each other every time he tried to pull free. When he looked down, he could see his thumb and index finger protruding from under the rock, but they were facing the wrong direction. The accident happened at exactly 2:42 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Ralston would remember this time for the rest of his life because he was constantly checking his watch, hoping someone would realize he was missing. But he had told his roommates he might be gone for a few days, and his job at an outdoor gear store didn't expect him back until Monday. Nobody was looking for him. Nobody even knew where to look. The first thing he tried was chipping away at the boulder with his multi-tool. For 18 hours straight, he scraped and hammered at the sandstone, creating a small pile of dust and rock chips. The knife blade dulled to the point where it could barely scratch the surface. His good hand developed blisters that burst and bled, but he kept working. After a full day, he had carved away maybe 2 pounds of rock. He needed to remove several hundred pounds. The physical reality of his situation was becoming clear. The boulder wasn't just heavy. It was perfectly wedged between the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to move. Even if he had a sledgehammer and unlimited time, he couldn't generate enough force to shift it. The canyon walls were solid sandstone, harder than concrete, and they provided perfect support for the rock that was crushing him. He was trapped in what amounted to a stone vise, and the vise was slowly winning. By the second day, his water was gone. The temperatures in the canyon dropped to near freezing at night and climbed above 100 degrees during the day. He was still wearing shorts and a t-shirt because it had been warm when he started hiking. At night, he pressed his body against the sun-warmed canyon wall and tried not to think about how cold he was. During the day, he stood in the thin strip of shade and tried not to think about how thirsty he was getting. The cold was almost as dangerous as the dehydration. Desert temperatures can drop 40 degrees after sunset, and Ralston had no way to stay warm except body heat. He would shiver uncontrollably for hours, burning calories his body couldn't afford to lose. His teeth chattered so hard he was afraid he might chip them. During the day, the sun turned his narrow prison into an oven, and he could feel his skin burning even in the shade. On the 3rd day, he started drinking his own urine. He'd saved it in his empty water bottle, and even though it tasted like liquid salt, It kept him alive for another day. He also started talking to his video camera, recording what he thought would be his final messages. His voice was already getting hoarse, but he wanted his parents to know he wasn't angry about dying. He wanted them to know he'd had a good life, and this was just bad luck. The video messages became his lifeline to sanity. He would talk to his parents, his sister, his friends, telling them stories about his favorite climbs, and thanking them for being part of his life. Sometimes he would just describe what he was seeing, the way the sunlight moved across the canyon walls, the colors in the rock formations, the sounds of wind echoing through the chambers above him. He was creating a record of his final hours, but he was also staying human in a place that was slowly erasing his humanity. The fourth day was when he started hallucinating. He saw his family sitting across from him in the canyon, just far enough away that he couldn't reach them. He had conversations with people who weren't there. He kept hearing helicopters that turned out to be the wind. His lips had cracked so badly that they bled when he tried to speak, and his tongue was swollen to twice its normal size. He was entering the final stages of dehydration. His body was shutting down in stages. First, his kidneys stopped producing urine, which meant the toxins in his blood were building up to dangerous levels. His heart rate became irregular as his blood volume dropped. His vision started to blur, and he had trouble focusing on objects that were right in front of him. He could feel his brain becoming foggy, and he had to concentrate just to remember his own name. Death was maybe 12 hours away, but something changed on the fifth morning. Instead of seeing his family, he had a vision of himself picking up a small boy with a prosthetic arm. The boy was calling him Daddy, and Ralston realized he was seeing his own future son. He was going to have a family, but only if he survived this canyon. That's when he decided to cut off his arm. The vision was so real that he could smell the child's hair and feel the weight of the boy in his arms. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a glimpse of what his life could be if he found a way out. But the only way out required doing something that seemed impossible. He had to cut off his own arm with a knife that was duller than most butter knives. The blade had been damaged by 5 days of scraping against solid rock, but it was his only option. The problem was that his multi-tool knife couldn't cut through bone. He'd tried before, but the blade was too dull and the bones in his forearm were too thick. However, he suddenly realized he could break his own bones first. If he could snap his radius and ulna, the knife might be able to cut through the remaining muscle and tendons. He positioned his trapped arm against the boulder and threw his body weight in the opposite direction. The technique he used was called torquing. He grabbed his forearm just above the trapped area and twisted his body in the opposite direction, using his trapped hand as a fulcrum. The radius bone snapped first, and the sound was like a gunshot echoing through the canyon. The pain was so intense that he screamed until his voice gave out. Then he repositioned his arm and broke the ulna the same way. Now both bones in his forearm were completely severed, and he could feel the sharp edges cutting into his flesh from the inside. The sound of his bones breaking was like snapping a thick tree branch. The pain was so intense that he nearly passed out, but he forced himself to stay conscious. Now he could feel the sharp edges of his broken bones pressing against his skin. He picked up the multi-tool and began cutting. The process took over an hour. He had to slice through muscle, tendons, and arteries with a knife that was duller than most kitchen knives. Every few minutes he had to stop and rest because the pain was making him dizzy. Blood was flowing steadily from the wound, but he knew he had to keep cutting, or he would die anyway. When he finally severed the last piece of tissue connecting his forearm to his body, he was free for the first time in 5 days. The actual cutting was methodical and deliberate. He started with the muscle tissue, which was the easiest to cut through. Then he had to slice through the tendons that controlled his fingers and wrist. These were tough and fibrous, like cutting through rope. The worst part was the arteries. When he cut through the radial artery, blood sprayed across the canyon wall like a fire hose. He had to work quickly now because he was losing blood fast. His right arm was still trapped under the boulder, but the rest of his body could move. He was losing blood rapidly from the amputation, but he had work to do. He tied a tourniquet around his upper arm using the tube from his water backpack. Then he wrapped the stump in medical tape and fabric from his shirt. He had maybe an hour before blood loss killed him, and he was still 14 miles from his truck. The tourniquet was the difference between life and death. Without it, he would have bled out in minutes. But tying it with one hand while in shock from blood loss and pain was almost impossible. He had to use his teeth to pull the tube tight, and then figure out how to secure it so it wouldn't come loose. The pressure had to be perfect, tight enough to stop arterial bleeding, but not so tight that it cut off circulation to his shoulder. The first obstacle was getting out of the canyon. He had to climb and rappel his way through 60 feet of narrow slot formations, all with one arm and while losing blood. He wedged his body against the canyon walls and worked his way up inch by inch. When he reached a section that required rappelling, he had to figure out how to control the rope with just one hand. Normally, rappelling required both hands to control speed and direction, but Ralston managed to wrap the rope around his body in a way that let him descend safely. The climbing was the hardest part. Slot canyons require a technique called stemming, where you press your back against one wall and your feet against the opposite wall, then inch your way up. With one arm, Ralston had to use his shoulder and his good elbow to maintain contact with the wall. Every few feet he had to stop and rest because the effort was exhausting. His body was already weak from dehydration and blood loss, and now he was asking it to do something that would challenge a healthy person. Once he was out of the slot canyon, he still had to hike 6 miles across the desert to reach the main trail where someone might find him. The sun was directly overhead and the temperature was over 100 degrees. He was wearing a wool hat and long pants that he'd put on during the cold nights in the canyon, but he couldn't take them off with one hand. His body was overheating, but he forced himself to keep walking. The desert crossing was a nightmare of heat and exhaustion. The ground was covered with loose sand that made every step difficult. He had to climb over rocks and navigate around thorny plants, all while trying not to disturb the tourniquet on his arm. Every few hundred yards, he had to stop and rest in whatever shade he could find. His body was running on pure adrenaline now, but he knew that wouldn't last much longer. After 4 hours of hiking, he was delirious from blood loss and heat exhaustion. He was stumbling every few steps and had to stop frequently to rest. That's when he saw 3 people hiking toward him on the main trail. They were a family from the Netherlands who had come to Utah specifically to hike in this area. Ralston waved at them with his good arm and called out for help. The family that found him was named Van der Merwe, and they were experienced hikers who had come to Utah to explore the canyon country. They had been hiking for 3 days and were heading back to their car when they saw a figure stumbling toward them across the desert. At first, they thought it was just another hiker, but as they got closer, they could see that something was terribly wrong. The family ran toward him and immediately saw the tourniquet and bloody stump where his right arm used to be. They gave him water and called for a helicopter using a satellite phone. The helicopter arrived within 30 minutes and flew him to a hospital in Moab, Utah. He was in surgery within 2 hours of being rescued. The rescue helicopter was a medical evacuation unit that had been standing by in Moab specifically for emergencies like this. The pilot had to navigate through narrow canyons and deal with desert thermals that made flying dangerous. The paramedics on board had seen traumatic injuries before, but they had never seen someone who had amputated their own arm. They worked frantically to stabilize Ralston during the flight, pumping him full of fluids and painkillers. Doctors said he would have died within another hour if the family hadn't found him. He had lost nearly 40% of his blood, and his body was shutting down from dehydration and shock. The amputation itself was remarkably clean considering he'd done it with a dull knife, but he had severed major arteries and was bleeding internally. They had to give him 4 units of blood just to stabilize him. The medical team was amazed by the quality of his self-amputation. Despite using a dull knife in terrible conditions, he had managed to cut through all the necessary tissues without causing additional damage to his upper arm. The tourniquet had been applied correctly, and his improvised bandages had helped control the bleeding. One surgeon said it was the best field amputation he had ever seen, and he couldn't believe it had been done by the patient himself. The boulder that trapped him is still in Blue John Canyon. The National Park Service decided to leave it there as a reminder of what happened, but they installed a plaque nearby that warns hikers about the dangers of traveling alone in remote areas. Ralston's severed arm was also left under the boulder. He said he didn't want it back, and the canyon seemed like the right place for it to stay. The recovery took months. Ralston had to learn how to do everything with one arm, from tying his shoes to driving a car. He went through physical therapy to strengthen his remaining arm and adapt to using a prosthetic. But the psychological recovery was harder than the physical recovery. He had nightmares about being trapped in the canyon, and he developed a fear of confined spaces that took years to overcome. 6 months after the accident, Ralston was fitted with a prosthetic arm that allowed him to continue climbing. He returned to mountaineering and eventually climbed all of Colorado's peaks over 14,000 feet, including several that required technical rock climbing with his prosthetic. He also became a motivational speaker and wrote a book about his experience, called Between a Rock and a Hard Place. The prosthetic arm was a marvel of engineering that allowed him to grip rocks and handle climbing equipment. It was connected to his remaining arm muscles through a system of cables and pulleys that translated muscle movements into mechanical actions. Learning to use it took months of practice, but eventually it became as natural as his original arm had been. The vision he had about his future son turned out to be real. Ralston married in 2009 and had a son in 2010. He taught the boy to climb and hike, and they've done several challenging peaks together. His son knows the story of how his father lost his arm, and he's proud that his dad was strong enough to save himself when no one else could help. But Ralston never returned to Blue John Canyon. He said there was nothing left for him there, and he had no desire to see the place where he almost died. The canyon remains one of the most remote and dangerous hiking areas in Utah, and very few people visit it each year. Those who do often stop at the boulder where Ralston was trapped and try to imagine what it would be like to cut off their own arm to survive. Most people can't imagine it. They think they would just give up and die, or they assume they would panic and make the situation worse. But Ralston proved that humans are capable of making impossible decisions when survival is the only option. He didn't just survive because he was tough or skilled. He survived because he was able to think clearly under pressure and do what needed to be done, even when what needed to be done was cutting off his own arm with a dull knife. The multi-tool he used is now in a museum in Colorado, displayed next to a piece of the boulder that trapped him. Visitors often ask if they can touch it, but the museum keeps it behind glass. The blade is still stained with his blood, and you can see the chips and scratches from when he tried to cut through solid rock. It's a reminder that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to having the right tool and the will to use it, even when using it means losing part of yourself forever.